think we're going good for sound. I've got good sound. You've got good sound, Peter. That's great. Okay, and I can assume that we're going on YouTube if Simon's able to tell us. If it's not, then I'm going to go for it. Just one quick check here.
All good.
Yep. Almost there. Okay. 5, 4, 3. Tēnā koutou katoa kua huhi mai ne I tēnei rā. Hello, everyone, and welcome in. I'm Bernard Hickey, the co-host of the Hoon. Well, great to see you.
Bernard, that was brilliant, Te Reo. We've only had one lesson and we're basically fluent now. Bernard and I had a fabulous Te Reo lesson the other day from a very nice Hoon listener who realised that our discussions of Korero, Kaipakihi and various other things were not what they should be. And that was brilliant, Bernard. I mean, it'll all stop once National's in, but that's fantastic. Good on you.
No mai haere mai. It is fantastic to be here.
Oh!
And I thank you to Jamie, a very generous and thoughtful subscriber to the Hoon.
I don't think he realises we're going to be doing it about 3 times a week for the next 4 years, though.
Oh, well, it's always good, and we will keep mixing it up with new things and learning. Our old brains, Peter, are becoming more...
My brain's completely plastic. It's just a rather, you know, how you have that sense of being plastic and it's mobile and labile and everything. Unfortunately, mine seems to be made of Bakelite.
Mine hardens over the years. Exactly. But it's it was really fun to spend some time with Jamie learning some more te reo. And
very grateful.
It's got me fired up a bit to have another crack at doing it properly. I actually did a year of te reo Māori at Massey University.
Of course you did. Yeah, when you were learning to be a socialist. Yeah.
I didn't quite get there completely. I turned a bit libertarian for a decade or so.
Did you?
But I am always interested in finding out more. Ngā mihi nui, Jamie. Great stuff. Now, this week is the last Hoon before the election.
And it's the last Hoon before you move overseas.
Yes, sort of, into the Hauraki Gulf. Lynn and I are moving into a home on the island out there in the Gulf, which is going to be a real pleasure. I have a special thing for listening to birds and being in nature and calming my Bakelite brain.
Yeah, and you're perfectly placed to have the new Robinson helicopter, your Kaka One.
The Kaka One.
Yeah, I think my friend Uta says something like 57, I think it is, helicopter pads have been approved on Waiheke. Now, Bernard, I digressed you slightly with the election. Are you saying we have to be careful what we say because Simon has to put out the podcast tomorrow? Is this what you're about to say to us?
I think we're reasonably safe. I doubt that either of us or any of our guests today, including Josie's Robert and also Max Rashbrook, will be pitching to people to vote and the recording being put up into the internet. But yes, we will try to avoid being too obviously political. And I'm sort of tempted to try and get this out reasonably early.
Yeah, good idea. And I think we agree that we're going to do predictions at the end?
I'm happy to. Predictions aren't so much the same as exhortations. So I think that's safe.
No, exactly, absolutely. Other than to vote, of course, which I already have. Bernard, also, I put virtual pen to virtual paper on your site this week, and I was partly because I was extremely offended by somebody who follows us and has been following us, and generally is very nice. But he accused me the other day of talking piffle on the Hoon.
That's a feature, not a bug.
Steady. So I went back and said to him, "It's surely it's top quality piffle."
Yeah, exactly.
So I did a piece for you this week about the media and how I think the media is influenced by talkback radio in New Zealand. Which when I listen to that woman Kerry Woodham, sometimes occasionally when something goes wrong and I can't get the BBC or some other highbrow thing. or another history podcast. Jesus Christ, it is so gormless. It's absolutely, it's mind-numbingly weird and gormless.
I have little snippets when I sometimes get into an actual taxi,
yes,
and it is quite a thing. There's a part of me that wants to turn the Hoon into the anti-Mike's Minute every day. Mike Hosking puts up a column every day saying something completely tossed off his shoulder about...
Tossed off is probably the right expression, actually, there. Yep.
And there's a part of me that wants to apply my charts and my carefully thought about numbers to dismantle his arguments every day. There's also a part of me that thinks life's too short. But the whole talkback thing is interesting. Your column, by the way, very successful and popular on the Kaka. I'd recommend everyone read it and get involved in the comments, because it told me a couple of interesting things I hadn't really thought about much. A, that Mike Hosking is getting nearly 600,000 listeners a day,
yep.
and that will be amplified, no doubt, by the things that go out onto the NZME websites, including, by the way, a brand new NZME website called News Talk Plus, which is a subscription-based...
I'm mostly irritated with that, Bernard, that they haven't rung me to be a columnist, but then I saw that they had they've signed Chris Trotter, who was, as someone once said to me, mad as a gum digger's dog. So
just as friendly. I like Chris. I edited his columns for several years when I was the editor of The Independent, and there's a part of me that quite likes Chris.
Oh no, me too. I've met him, and he's one of those people, which is very common in journalism and in politics, who've been through a sort of 360-degree life of every he a friend of mine has this expression. He says, God, we're going to touch every spot on the moral compass here. And I don't think it's so much on the moral compass, but he's definitely touched all the points on the political compass.
Yeah, he does have a corporate memory, if you like, of
absolutely. And we we do need people over 12 to do but having said, being rude about Mike Hosking is kind of a national obsession, but I think
the 500,000 people who...
Well, exactly, and I think Steve Brownius has a point about Hosking, that he is an incredible pro at the thing that he's paid to do. So anyway, speaking of hot air, there's Catherine.
Who is our dedicated hot air correspondent? Sorry, that's a rude
hot air expert.
Catherine is the climate correspondent for the Kaka. It's wonderful to have had you doing work with us in the last couple of months on the climate, even though we just had an election debate which hardly mentioned it, including the election debate last night, the final one, the big one with lots of fireworks, between Christopher Luxon and Chris Hipkins, which did not mention the climate once. Isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah, really extraordinary.
They didn't get a chance to talk about their electric cars and their recycling.
No, not
their
even
deep
that.
and profound commitment.
Yeah, well, so we decided to put together a piece which summarised the various party policies and came up with a few ideas of our own, or ones that we thought were quite good from the collection, which we put out as a Kaka project piece. Catherine, what's your overall impression of what we've seen in this election debate about the climate?
Well, as far as the climate goes, I mean, obviously there's the absence of any good debate going on between the two major parties. And when you look through all of their policy statements as well, you find there's not really a lot of effort going into solving big problems, and not just climate for that matter. Other big problems that we have aren't really getting talked about or solved. But any real ideas that are out there are coming from the minor parties on the fringes, and there is some good stuff there, but it hasn't had as much of an airing as I feel like it should have. So, I was saying earlier, I think if there was anything we could have done that would have been nice, it would have been to take away some of the oxygen from the two Chris's and put it out to some of the minor parties to actually talk about.
But what is the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere? Because Winston Peters seems to have a fairly clear idea about what the percentage of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And it's about, well, you remember he got caught, Bernard, because I think he said it was 30 times less than it is. It was some ludicrous old man's,
Shaking
thing.
his fist at the
Yeah,
sky.
shaking his fist at the,
At the air. That's right. No, it is fairly sobering, shocking, but ultimately not surprising that both main parties have steered away from any policies that would challenge Ford Ranger Man to either get out of the Ford Ranger or buy an electric Ford Ranger or have to pay more for the Ford Ranger. Or not be able to park the Ford Ranger on Ponsonby Road.
I'm still concerned about this attacking Ford Rangers all the time.
No, I'm quite happy about attacking Ford Ranger because it is Ford Ranger Nation. It is the most popular new vehicle sold for over a decade. And unlike in other countries where they have other types of cars, this and the Toyota Hilux have dominated our sales charts. It is
But
a real
US
thing.
sales are dominated by SUVs, straight no SUV,
But this isn't an
or
SUV.
in
this
our
is a double
case,
cab.
trucks. I know.
Yeah.
It's because we're all tradies.
I read something this morning, and I'm just trying to remember which city it was, if it was Paris or London or something, where they said that by 2030 they're not going to allow
Yes, it's Paris.
any internal combustion engined vehicles into the city centre. So they'll have to park on the outskirts
no.
and walk.
No, but they've already banned SUVs. I'm
They
sorry.
have.
I think
You're well ahead of me.
know,
I mean, I like this idea, like make them park on the outskirts and either have to walk in or catch public transport to
Yeah,
get the
I mean,
rest of
you've
the
got
way.
the double cab ute, put the bike on the back. You
the
can
war
actually
against the
bike as
car.
well.
Yet again, as Rishi Sunak has talked about in the UK, the war against the car. Not the
Is
car,
Rishi
but
Sunak
the war
watching
against the car.
Watching the Hoon. Is he commenting on YouTube?
Yeah. But I just to give you a slight irony about your fraud. So some contractors, very nice, very, very nice and highly intelligent contractors who are specialists in geotech and slip control, came around to the house next door to mine the other day, Bernard, which you've seen, where they're putting in, I think, the biggest seawall that's been put in since the last biggest seawall.
Can I ask who's
And I have to admit that they came in a very nice, brand new Ford Ranger, and I thought, oh, that's quite sexy. It does, it was about up to my shoulder, and I thought, God, if I got a ladder, I could have one of those. But it did seem to me to be moderately ironic that they were coming to fix one of the biggest slips in Auckland, which I'm very grateful for, but coming in a Ford Ranger.
This is the thing. All of these repairs.
I didn't blame them. I didn't
and
say that
work
because I
that's
just
gonna
wanted
be
to fix
It's
it.
going to burn more fossil fuel, and we have to stop burning fossil fuel. It strikes me that this election was the one we were supposed to talk about climate after Gabrielle, and we shouldn't forget this is an event which is now going to happen quite regularly. However you measure it, maybe it was previously viewed as a one.
Bernard's just frozen for a second there, Catherine. So let me ask you the question.
Frozen, yeah.
Well, it struck me that with the progression of the Greens this time in the election, I don't mean to preempt our election coverage, but it's potentially quite interesting to think about if there were a left-leaning coalition or a central-left coalition and the Greens were in it, whether they might actually be much more influential than they have been historically. Do the Greens actually have policies that you concur with?
Oh, yeah. I spent a bit of time reading through their full policy document and thought, actually, there's a lot of things in here that I like the look of, that I concur with. So, yeah, I think it would certainly be interesting. And they've definitely, I mean, that's the balance that they've had to try and deal with, right? As if they're in the government and have the climate ministerial portfolio, then they can't kind of challenge some of the thinking from outside. And we've sort of benefited from having, because James Shaw does have a lot of deep technical knowledge about climate change issues and has been able to get some good things in place, but they've really lost their voice for a lot of years in terms of actually, getting a stronger conversation going from the wings.
And one of the ironies.
Oh, you're still there. Jesus, you're lurking in the background.
Turn my camera off to improve the data. But one of the ironies is that because the Greens have been so anonymous, they're popular. Because if people actually looked at their policies in the middle, they would go, they're actually saying they want to reduce GDP which is actually what we discovered, Catherine, in looking through the policies, which may or may not be a good thing, but it's the thing. And a wealth tax is something that crosses all sorts of red lines for a whole bunch of red-blooded people, and it's very interesting to see them likely to be a significant part of the Parliament. The most recent poll that we've just seen out today from Talbot Mills actually shows Labor and the Greens collectively ahead of National and ACT. But of course, with Christopher Luxon having swallowed the rat of saying he would talk to us.
Oh God, that's such a grotesque. Talk to people in New York about swallowing rats. Yeah. Carry on.
And interestingly, Chris Hipkins saying he won't talk to Winston. Essentially, we're going to have a situation where the least popular set of parties is probably going to be in government, just like we had in 2017 when National was outraged that even though they, quote, won the election, they lost the election. So it is an interesting one. I think one of the things I sort of enjoyed doing, and I'm very keen to do it more often, is to pick out the policies that look, I think, more effective at achieving some things and actually talk about them rather than the ones that the political commentators have said is deemed to be politically acceptable to talk about in public because it might actually make it into some sort of
I think that's definitely part of your. You can have the cat on the same thing, Catherine. Two cats, cat Dyer and cat. But
Harry,
people on the
name.
Is it people on the pod want to know what the cat's
Harry.
name and
Harry is incredibly good looking and the furriest cat you've ever seen.
He's busy knocking things off my desk.
Yeah, well, he looks like a fairly chunky chap.
He is a chunky chap.
But it's, Cousin, that idea that Bernard just said about critiquing policy, as you did in this thing about green policies, it is part of Bernard's mission for the solutions journalism. And I was really struck. I think I sent it to you, not for last week's pod with this one, but Al Gore was being very positive about the possibilities. It is important not to be completely negative while being really firm. So we also had, I think it's now definite, the hottest September, right? Bernard was having a little coronary about that the other day.
Yeah, we had the numbers through sort of last week, but confirmed this week that the temperature in September was a record for September and 0.5 degrees Celsius above the previous record, which I think I mentioned last time is like someone beating Usain Bolt's 100-meter record by a second.
Yeah.
It is off the charts, notable, and there is lots of debate about what exactly is causing it, apart from the climate scientists saying that climate warming is contributing to the extremities of this rise in temperature. There may be some factors driven by the removal of sulfur from fuel oil, also the Tongan eruption and the onset of El Nino, but the underlying cause is the burning of fossil fuels and the fact we've just had an election debate where the most pressing threat to human life in our lifetimes now is bearing down on us, and it wasn't mentioned once in our final debate between the leaders.
Yeah, I'd say the most positive thing I always say about the stuff is that at every step of the way there are going to be choices. No matter how badly or well things are going, there are always going to be choices, and some of those choices will make things better and some of them will make them actively worse. And our job is to try and figure out which of those two things any particular proposal is going to achieve.
And off the top of my head, before we head on to the foreign affairs stuff, I would ban used and new imports of petrol and diesel cars.
Jesus.
By a date, 2030. Ensure that between now and then we have a massive increase in the quality of the engines coming in, so they're not spewing so much stuff out and they're not quite so carbon dioxide intensive. I would make one of the options that Top put forward is a $1,500 credit for people to get electric bikes and buggies and that sort of thing. I would get NZTA to make buggies legal. At the moment, it's illegal to import a buggy like a golf buggy that you would use on a road. Convert the main roads, just simply remove the car parks on these main roads, the Ponsonby roads, the New North roads,
Jesus.
the Adelaide
So
roads.
this is an agenda. How am I going to get my 1984 left-hand drive Renault here from Spain if you're going to ban it, for Christ's sake? But I did,
big battery
I did once go, Bernard, I am thinking about getting a Volkswagen Carmen Ghia it's on sale at the moment for $65,000, and then you put another $75,000 and put a Tesla battery into it. And I think that would be pretty cool. Yeah. But Bernard, I once went stayed a weekend in Alexander Graham Bell's house in a beachside place in Virginia, and cars were banned. And the entire place
I didn't realise it was one of your contemporaries.
No, I didn't say Alexander Graham Bale. Yeah. Hello, can you hear me through there? Can you hear me in the other room? And the entire place was filled with golf carts. And of course, being Americans, some of the golf carts were customized to look like Ferraris and Cadillacs and Porsches and tractors. So it was you can still have fun with a golf cart. Now, speaking of issues that have been sidelined from the election campaign, we have Professor Robert Patman on, and he has come up with a new word to me, which is intermestic issues. Now, I suggested that he sounded like a urologist talking about intermestic, but or we have intermestic disputes in my house when somebody's away overseas. But Robert, you did a really good piece this week about the issues that were missing from the campaign. We're going to generally focus on the New Zealand election in the second half of the podcast, but I thought that was a really valuable thing, and it's an excellent segue from the issues that Catherine thinks are not being discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and good afternoon, Peter and Bernard. I mean, the term intermestic, of course, is just for our viewers and listeners, it's just a crossover term between the domestic and the international, and we are getting a proliferation of these sort of issues.
Absolutely.
And I don't see that trend being reversed. And the article that you referred to, I just hit upon, or rather identified, is probably a better way of putting it, 3 such issues which are having a big effect on New Zealand, irrespective of how we vote in the election. And one is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its direct challenge to New Zealand's vision of a rules-based international order. Secondly, AUKUS has got very little attention during the election, but also has momentous consequences for New Zealand's redefined national identity based on a principled independent foreign policy, based on closer relationship with the Pacific, based on, I think, a redefined sense of nationality, which is inclusive of Maori and language and culture. So basically, the question of whether we join the Anglosphere or not is actually quite significant. And thirdly, the one that you've already touched on with Catherine, climate change. The Greens have tried to, and I watched James Shaw. He did, I think, quite an effective job in the debate amongst the minor parties in articulating the urgency of this issue. But it's been disappointing because, in a sense, we are, as the IMF have pointed out, not only not meeting our obligations, which are supposed to be, I think, under called the Paris Climate Accord, which we signed, we're supposed to be reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. Apparently, we're off track. And that doesn't bode well for the much more ambitious commitment of basically having zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Robert, you saying that and thinking about it being discussed during the election, I just had an image of ostriches sticking their head into the sand, and it suddenly occurred to me, I'm not sure whether mowers stuck their heads into the sand. We're related enough to do that, but it is very hard in election campaigns to get people to think about the important things. And before you came on, somebody was saying, and of course, once cost of living issues come out as an issue, then everything else goes out the window. One of our lovely subscribers, readers, groupies, David Coombs, asked if you and I would, or we could take a quick look at Ukraine, because I think we're going to move on when Josie gets on to discuss Israel and Hamas and what's going on. There's actually been some quite big news since we started the podcast. But the Ukraine situation, it's clear that Zelensky realizes that he's in deep shit with Israel now dominating the headlines. And also we've seen some evidence of, somebody was talking to me last week about the idea of a Russian Tet offensive. There's a bit of quite aggressive Russian reclaiming of land, or attempts to reclaim land. Shall we give people just a perspective on what we think is going on in Ukraine?
Sure. Just a quick qualifying point on the cost of living thing. Those 3 points we just discussed actually do intersect with the cost of living thing.
Absolutely.
It's just that people it's difficult to actually see the connection. But on the Ukraine thing, yes, the Russians have started offensive. Apparently, they have suffered very, very heavy losses. But yes, it's a nice touch by Mr. Putin to offer to mediate between Hamas and Israel.
He's so good at it. Yeah.
And having he knows all about devastation, and he knows about cities reduced to rubble, and so he's offered, but yeah,
and the killing of children and
the
civilians.
Thing, attention has switched, but the war goes on, and I don't think Michael McFaul, the former US ambassador, made this point recently. I don't think there's any sign, certainly, that Mr. Putin's information machine is making the case that, the West is now getting Ukraine fatigue. But I think Michael McFaul has made the point he doesn't see any evidence of that on the ground. And the Germans have just made a big arms package available to the Ukrainians.
Which includes the Taurus long-range missile, according to David Coombs, who
Really?
essentially I just listened to.
I didn't hear that. I heard that it includes more Patriot anti-missile batteries. I think the Taurus would be a welcome addition, but there is an initiative to accelerate the use of F-16s. I think 11 countries are now involved in the training. So I don't actually see that the Europeans are going to back off this. I think they've realised that Ukraine is not simply, the conflict in Ukraine is not confined to Ukraine. And that
And the Americans have approved the ATACMS, right?
Yeah.
Which is this extraordinary, I think it's 500 kilometers, does it reach out to, or 380 or something?
At least.
You know,
I
super high accuracy. So
they
you can
will
see.
only get a few, though, Peter. That's my understanding. But as we've seen with other weapons, which are asked for and then sort of measured out, that can lead to more and more being provided. But it takes a while.
And we also had, Robert, just quite an interesting thing with Finland this week. Of course, Finland's just joined NATO for the first time and there seems to be some suspicious activity which have put a hole in a gas pipeline between Finland and Lithuania, which is their primary connection to the rest of Europe.
Well, the Russians, to their credit, did warn Finland that there would be consequences for them joining NATO, and they've also threatened Sweden along similar lines. So maybe that's one of the consequences. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Ukrainian conflict is that the Americans, the danger here, I suppose, is whether the Europeans, if the Americans, for various domestic reasons, cannot sustain this level of commitment to Ukraine, and with the conflict now between Israel and Hamas developing rapidly, and perhaps bringing other actors in, there may be, that may become an even more pertinent question, that America gets, in the words of that great historian Paul Kennedy, suffers from military overstretch. I doubt it, because I think the American military-industrial complex, which seems to be doing rather well, actually, it can probably cope. But
I thought you were about to quote that famous military historian Yogi Berra. It's deja vu all over again.
What's interesting, though, we've obviously got Russia, while no one's watching too closely, doing its thing. But the other thing that's happened without too much fanfare is that this week Russia decided to reimpose capital controls because of the collapse of the ruble. and this is against the advice of its central bankers and the likes. So there is intense pressure on Russia's economy and on its currency and its foreign reserves. Yes, it's able to sell oil. The sanctions haven't really worked effectively, but it is taking a discount. And interestingly, because of the rise in oil prices, just a couple of weeks ago, it banned the export of diesel, i.e. it's got problems refining and using enough diesel for itself, let alone exporting it as it used to Europe. So the pressure is on Russia, and even though the world's attention is in the Middle East right now, it's not going away.
Yeah, so of course there's all sorts of speculation and conspiracy theories that Russia may have had something to do with the timing of the attack to take the pressure off Western support. I mean, let's be quite clear, and I think you made this very clear in your excellent piece, Peter, that this
but
is
it wasn't as excellent as yours,
conflict.
Robert. It wasn't as excellent as yours.
It was a long-running conflict, and it was just waiting to happen, really. What I found fascinating, and I'd be very interested to hear your perspectives as well. I think, while I understand the almost blank check response of the administration in Washington, particularly a year out before an election, I think the Americans are taking a considerable risk. And why I say that is because the groundswell of support for the victim of this horrendous and appalling terror attack by Hamas is generating a response which does not discriminate between those who orchestrated this appalling act and those who were just happened to be in the same territory from which it was initiated. Now, the reason I say this is because one of the questions that I pondered immediately after the attack is to what extent was Hamas, if you like, representing the feelings of the population in Gaza. Now, then I reflected on it, and it occurred to me that if the very sophisticated intelligence apparatus of Israel was caught cold by this attack, it was a huge surprise, a stunning surprise, the biggest the Israelis had experienced since the Yom Kippur War, 1973. It's highly unlikely that Hamas shared its intention to attack Israel with the population's civilian population of Gaza. So these are innocent people. And what we're witnessing now is the looming humanitarian tragedy there.
Yeah, well, what's also happened, Robert, since we've been on air, as it were, is that the Israelis have issued a notice to the United Nations to help or to make sure that all civilians are moved from Gaza City out to the there's 2.5 million to the south.
So they're lifting the blockade?
No. To move exactly to the south of Gaza. So there's Khan Yunis further south, which is another city in part of the Strip. I mean, I made a point. Well, I hope it was a valid point in my earlier spin-off thing this week, not the one I've shared with the audience. That the Gaza Strip, really, it's the Gaza City. Gaza Strip is about the size of a bit bigger than Wellington, and Israel itself is about the size of the Waikato. So we're not talking about large areas here. And so this, they would appear to be going in the next 24 hours or so. They've made a 24-hour warning that the UN needs to help get rid of the people from northern Gaza.
But it's a bit cheeky, having put people in Gaza under a 17-year air, land, and sea blockade to ask for the UN, whose budget of about 5.2 billion a year, less than probably a few offices in the State Department.
That's true. Yeah, I think
it's very cheeky for them to say, "Oh, could you move the population?"
No, it's more than cheeky. It's an extremely and it may rebound. I mean, I think if I could, one thing I saw as well today, which I'll try and put into the links on the YouTube, is an absolutely extraordinary Hamas promotional video of how they built tens of thousands of rockets, the work that they've gone on. It's like a sort of promotional video for a industrial complex, and you have to wonder what could have been applied to civilian and farming and industry in Gaza had it not been applied to this. Now, I think let's just also, can we just deal with some of the international aspects since we've got you on?
Right.
We know what happens. We've seen what happens previously to Gazan citizens who oppose Hamas.
Yeah.
It's also true, that Hamas is apart from Israel, is the only democratically elected government in the Middle East.
Yeah, but that was what, 2006, 2007?
2006. Yeah, it hasn't been too many of them. There hasn't been too many in the
haven't been
Palestinian
re-elected.
Authority either. But they and Iran have a near absolute horror of the idea of normalizations of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
So there are big forces at work here, as well as the historic oppression of Palestinians.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it's the Hamas versus. I was just rereading something about Yasser Arafat today, because it's to do with this word terrorist, and we'll get onto that hopefully in a moment from a media point of view. But sometimes you have to bring people who've committed terrorist acts or acts of terror to the negotiating table. And we had Yasser Arafat at the White House with Yitzhak Rabin signing and agreeing the Oslo Accords, which admittedly Yasser Arafat then completely fucked up by supporting Saddam during the Iraq War. But you've got these deeper forces. It isn't just the historic problems of Palestinians and the unfairness of Israel. It's a war as much between Hamas and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority as it is in the sense between Hamas and, because they're trying to claim the motivation and to be the true representatives of oppressed Palestinians.
And Hamas point to the fact that the Fatah, the governing body in the Palestinian Authority, and of course the derived from the PLO, they have recognized Israel and have ruled out violence. And Hamas say, well, look, that's the conditions in the West Bank are appalling. What good has it done them? So I think part of their appeal has been, the idea that resistance, but I think also Hamas is completely unrealistic. Their idea of throwing Israel into the sea and dismantling the Israeli state is just preposterous, and it's not going to work. And my fear, and I think this has been articulated by a lot of Israelis who have been critical of Mr. Netanyahu, that Hamas have effectively resurrected or pumped new life into the Netanyahu regime with their appalling tact. But
I think that is really important. The Netanyahu factor in all this is incredibly important. It does appear as though, and there's very good reports now, that Egypt warned the Israeli government that there was something coming. We know that Netanyahu, though, is an incredible performer, and I literally mean performer, in a crisis like this. And also, he's formed it's very difficult because he will exploit this. You're right that he holds a huge amount of responsibility for this, but he and his ilk will also crap all over the reservists who effectively went on strike.
Is it going to be extended, though, to Iran? And is there going to be some sort of two-fronty thing where you've got a war with Hamas and also a war on the border with Lebanon?
With Hezbollah, yes.
But I want to come back to international involvement because my
you,
colleague, Dr. Leon Goldsmith, wrote an excellent piece in the Herald today, and I commend it. Egypt's position in this is very interesting. Yes, they gave a vague warning 3 days before, but there is some ambiguity about Egypt's position in relation to this. They were quite
absolutely
uncomfortable about some of the normalization going on between Israel and other Arab states because it began to downgrade the position of the military regime in Cairo. The other thing is, where did Hamas get all these Iranian? How did these weapons get into Gaza? Now, where did they go into Gaza? I don't think they went through the part of the blockade that was managed by Israel.
No,
the other part,
highly unlikely.
Yeah, right. So then the question is, did Egypt notice these weapons being pushed in?
Yes.
I don't know. It's a sensitive issue, but
the tunnels
I
in the Sinai.
People have a look at that article. Leon has, who's a Middle East specialist, has made some interesting observations there, suggesting there's a few outside actors that may have some motivations in this confrontation, which do not immediately hit the eye. And warning Israel in that public manner could be cited as cover for Egypt's determination to remain crucial to, in the eyes of the United States, to the security situation in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I think we should make clear, Bernard's dying to come in, but let's just make clear, and I don't mean this just as a pro forma statement, but having immersed myself, and I've been quite exhausted by this week because I stupidly stepped into a Twitter row defending the BBC's non-use of the word terrorist by their own reporters with John Simpson the other day, which has led to an absolutely phenomenal barrage. You can have two ideas in the same about this. You can believe that terror acts have been committed, that the behavior of Hamas or other guerrillas in southern Israel is absolutely appalling, crimes against humanity, everything else. And you can then say also you understand Israel's right and responsibility and understand to react. But then you have to understand also what we're seeing in Gaza now with civilians, because it's such a packed place and they have nowhere to go, and also the historic legacies in this on both sides. So I just want to say that because anything we say can and will be taken out of context, but it is possible to hold more than one idea in your head at the time.
Yeah, and what we do know from New Zealand's point of view, we in the past, I think 1985, New Zealand was the victim of state-sponsored terrorism. So non-state actors don't have a monopoly on terrorism, and that's something we should.
Sorry, which one are you talking about, Robert?
The Rainbow Warrior.
Oh, I see. I thought
when the French agents blew up the Rainbow Warrior and
yeah.
killed somebody in the process, and that outraged many people in this country, quite rightly. But all I'm saying is that, this term terrorism, it basically is sometimes used almost exclusively for non-state actors.
That's right.
And
actually,
I'm
that's
not sure that's the case.
Okay, well, let's also, but that's actually, I might come down, and I talked to you the other day about getting a degree based on our podcasts and my columns, an honorary degree, because I was reading something about Yasser Arafat today and trying to think about this question, and there are many, many really good, thoughtful academic pieces about the nexus or the difficulty of asymmetric war, and that non-state actors, for non-state actors, terror attacks, the weapon of terror, is to some extent what they have available to them. And then, of course, you get, as you say, similar tactics deployed by nation states. But we know from the Good Friday Agreement that at some point that conversation has to happen. We know from the Oslo Accords that was on the direction, and then it was an Israeli, if arguably, an Israeli terrorist who killed Yitzhak Rabin.
It was. That was a crucial development.
An extremist, let's say. I mean, I'm not bound by the BBC rules, but I do understand why they're there, absolutely. But it is this idea of asymmetric war. It doesn't legitimize what happened in some of those kibbutz and villages, and certainly not. No, and I'm not the killing of those people at the concert, which was literally a peace concert. There's been actually a particularly interesting thing, little snippet, Robert, that allegedly various members of Islamic Jihad and various other super extreme Palestinian groups managed to go through with the Hamas soldiers. So Hamas guerrillas through, because they hadn't expected to be quite so successful in breaking through. And I think there's a sort of certain amount of blame being put on these even more extreme people. But either way, it is an appalling scene.
It is. And I mean, I do think that most of the world really sympathizes quite rightly with the civilians and the victims of this. And I don't think there can be any condoning this appalling act. And I think my concern is I would have been more encouraged if America reflected on its own experience of 9/11 when it declared a war on terror, which led to an illegal invasion of a country like Iraq. If it encouraged Israel to specifically target Hamas, say, we are going to give you as much help as you need, but you must and should target the people who have masterminded this and orchestrated it and caused all this appalling
which is pretty much what Blinken said.
Just
today.
But ensuring that civilians who were not involved and had nothing to do with it, and all the journalists on the ground in Gaza have said that many Palestinians were stunned the rockets were being launched by Gaza.
I'm actually surprised, Robert, that we haven't seen more from the West Bank yet, which in a sense is a good sign, but almost anything could set it off. And we've seen very modest action on the Lebanon border.
But they have taken what the Israeli government calls security precautions in the West Bank,
absolutely.
which I think that means very very tough control.
Yeah, Bernard, sorry.
Is Netanyahu, though, going to make good on his promise about changing the Middle East? And is there still a risk that Israel has a go at Iran and the whole thing blows up across the Middle East rather than be confined to Gaza?
Well, I think there's that risk because Hezbollah have already been involved in a skirmish with Israel. And Hezbollah is basically an extension of Iran, in my view. It's an instrument of the Iranians and has been for quite a long time. So there is a real risk there, Bernard. And as we know, one of the predictable things about war or conflict is it often defies all our expectations. And it doesn't take much, given the it may not, it may happen by miscalculation almost.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's also so interesting in this, and I think it is, there's a book being written as we speak, in a sense, because Netanyahu is himself deeply troubled by the idea of normalizing relations, because the Saudis are not going to do it without some level of recognition of Palestinian statehood or a path to statehood, and that causes Netanyahu unbelievable problems with the settlers and with the right wing of his coalition. Even though he's now got a sort of coalition of a national savior coalition, in a sense, temporarily for this attack.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges thrown out by this appalling crisis is basically countries like New Zealand do need to remind all concerned that there has to be, a military solution. There's the military power, the application of massive military power is not going to solve the political problem. You could reduce the Gaza Strip to desert, as Mr. Netanyahu's threatened. Mm-hmm. And what will that achieve apart from alienating even more Palestinians and, if you like, setting in motion another round of violence down the road, maybe 5 or 10 years? And that's the depressing thing about this. By all means, the people responsible for this terrorism need to be brought fully to account and dealt with, but there must be if you like, a political objective, a goal to try to find a pathway of reconciling Israel's desire, understandable desire for security, and the Palestinians' long-held desire for self-determination and statehood. And those two things have got to be reconciled. That takes courage to articulate that, because at the moment it's all about revenge and vengeance, but that is not going to make Israel more secure.
Robert, I was really struck thinking about this, and again, we've talked about it a little bit offline in our regular, gin conversations when I gin you up. It took, Menachem Begin.
Send you another bottle.
I haven't finished that one yet. Actually,
it took Menachem Begin, one of the Stern gang, described by the British occupying powers as a terrorist organization, blew up the King David Hotel. It took him to make a lead on peace. It took Ariel Sharon, who presided over the Sabra and Shatila massacres in the camps in Beirut, to take the bold and courageous decision to withdraw from Gaza. It sometimes takes a real hard man. I'm not convinced that Netanyahu is that hard man, although he would be the perfect kind of hard man.
I think the sort of person you were talking about was Yitzhak Rabin.
Well, Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated,
yes. The Palestinians, with great distinction from an Israeli point of view, was seen as a patriot, but reached the pragmatic decision that the Palestinians and the Israelis, there were good people on both sides, and they had to learn to live together peacefully and hopefully in two democratic states. But that takes a lot of courage, and he paid for it with his life. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I want to address, which is probably possibly the most dangerous thing for us to address in this, in a sense, and we do have to go to New Zealand politics in a minute, but it actually applies here, is this. So it is horrifying to me, but I understand it. But because we talk about the risks of collective punishment being carried out in Gaza, and collective punishment is a war crime. It's turning Gaza into the Warsaw Ghetto, in a sense, and of course that comparison's also been made with the attacks on southern Israel. But the idea that you then start attacking or criticizing or hurting or criticizing Jews and Israelis outside Israel is just extraordinary to me, and I think we have to guard against it very, very carefully. And one of the things that I hadn't quite appreciated, thinking about having heard it at various events and so on, the chant that you hear at Palestinian marches of from the river to the sea, Palestine shall one day be free, is almost literally almost word for word out of the Hamas covenant. And I think, it's quite catchy, but the implications of it are quite horrifying.
They are indeed, and the tragedy of this situation is at the moment is that there, if you like, the hard line or the more extremist voices have got the upper hand in the major participants in this conflict, and that's not in any way justifying the Hamas attack, which is, as we said, just beyond the pale and needs to be dealt with. But it's interesting to me that if you read and look at a number of Israeli publications, admittedly liberal ones, I think you mentioned this, Peter, Haaretz, and some other publications, very, very critical of the Israeli government, both on strategic grounds, but also what they see as creating a climate which has actually empowered Hamas within the Palestinian camp rather than diminished it.
Yeah, and it's also people from Shin Bet, from former heads of Mossad, former heads of security. Yeah, we should probably move to New Zealand because I think we have an election tomorrow. And are you standing, Robert?
No.
Oh, what's your prediction for the outcome tomorrow night?
Well,
please, not your hope, but your prediction.
I think it's going to be a lot closer than the polls have suggested for much of the campaign. I think Hipkins has actually shown himself to be, in terms of the debates I've watched, quite able and very quick. And I thought yesterday, a lot of the media commentators thought it was desperation stuff by Hipkins. I thought Hipkins actually was assertive, but he probably needed to be, and I thought he did a pretty competent job in a number of areas. But yeah, I mean, it's we know there's up to 17% of the population haven't made up their mind. That could be crucial. Certainly, Labour's been rising, and National have been stagnating a little bit. I mean, one of the stories of this campaign, is it not, that the two major parties have not done particularly too well.
Are you taking over our podcast when I ask you one simple short question?
Sorry. These are good points.
Thank you very much, Robert.
The one thing we can say is, though, there will be a Deputy Prime Minister called Winston Peters at some point.
Oh, I thought you were going to say with a Prime Minister called Chris.
No.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. Max, thanks so much for coming on, because we've thank you very much, Robert. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Max, you're our segue into New Zealand politics, because Bernard and I are going to get so pissed tonight that we wouldn't even dream of breaching the regulations of promoting election
but
tomorrow.
One of the things I was really keen to do after a sometimes dispiriting election campaign where our politicians haven't talked about the things that we care about and we know there are problems and haven't, in the centre at least, provided solutions, is that there may be other ways to do democracy. And I saw, Max, that you've been doing a presentation this week on a trial for a deliberative democracy, I suppose you could call it, in Wellington. Could you talk a bit more about this? This gave me hope. I was curious after the last 2 months of an election debate.
Yeah. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for the chance to talk about it. Yeah, so Wellington City Council has been experimenting with this thing called a citizens' assembly, where the basic concept is you get a group of ordinary people, in this case about 40 people, and you select them so that they're exactly demographically representative of the city as a whole. So, 50-50 male, female, split, Māori and Pacifica representative people in proportion to their proportion of the Wellington population. So they're a mini public, they're Wellington in a room, if you like, and then you set them loose on an important topic of public interest. And the idea here is to bring citizens like really deeply into the heart of decision making. So it's not so the stuff is sort of done with and by citizens rather than to them. So politics is more bottom up. You're sort of bringing the wisdom of the crowd to bear on, important public issues. You're taking advantage of the fact that people may not be subject matter experts, but they're experts in their own lives. And you're really getting a feel for what does the public actually want.
And this is a
Which you
very
can only find out when you've got a representative group of people and they have to discuss the issues with each other.
And this is a very, deep and historically viable idea. Essentially, this is what a trial by a jury of your peers.
I was just about to say it's
actually
a very yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I understand you were a bit of a fly on the wall. Is that right? And able to see whether this thing could work.
Yeah, so it happened. It's just happened over the last 4 Saturdays in Wellington, and I sat in on pretty much every minute of it. Look, it was really interesting. I mean, it was a bit of an experiment. Wellington hadn't really done one before, and they were asking the 40, sort of ordinary Wellingtonians to take a view on what the council should do with its long-term plan, which is sort of its 10-year strategy.
Only 10 years.
And yeah. So it was sort of a tall order, and normally citizens' assemblies, like sort of, there's been these couple of famous-ish ones in Ireland, which have been really influential, but they led to change on quite sort of defined issues like abortion reform and marriage equality. And the 10-year plan for a council that spends $1 billion a year is pretty complex stuff, and they probably didn't have all the information they needed. I don't think the city council got it quite right. I don't think the city council understood exactly what the citizens needed. And so about halfway through, they sort of had to pivot from this idea that they could have basically sort of designed an alternative budget for Wellington for 10 years to coming up with recommendations which were more thematic. So sort of saying, well, we want to see greater emphasis on this. So they came up with about 10 recommendations, which got consensus from the whole group and had been sort of tested and trialed and workshopped and refined. And they were things like saying, well, we want to see the council actively exploring alternative sources of revenue, because there's obviously only so much you can do with rates and borrowing. We want the council to put more emphasis on medium density housing, but if it's got, if there are like decrepit old buildings in Wellington that it owns, maybe they should be bold, and maybe there should be green space in their place, because actually Wellingtonians are short of access to really good pocket park.
Wellington, I think I like the idea of Wellington as the new Detroit.
Yeah. I mean, these
Practically
are
it's already.
things. Yeah, and all the things that the sort of citizens wanted to see, and they said very explicitly, we want funding for really core NGOs like Rape Crisis and Wellington City Mission to be preserved. So they came up with recommendations which were really sensible. They've been tested.
Yep.
They've been the subject of debate. I think you could legitimately say these are what all 200,000 Wellingtonians, if you stuck them in a room and got them to debate things, this is probably what they would come up with.
Yeah. Max,
And
one of our great. Sorry, forgive me.
I was just going to end and say, and the council has received the recommendations and have said very beautiful things about them. So it's on them now to take them into account.
So one of our John Irving, one of our viewers said, or listeners said, how the representatives chosen. You may feel you've actually covered that, and how might they be chosen in the future if you were to have a council of this kind or an advisory body of this kind?
So they're selected by an independent company that does this stuff professionally, and it's by what's called sortition. So 10,000 invites were sent out. About 800 people said, I'd be happy to take part, and then this independent private company selected them to be representative of the city in demographic terms.
Is there a risk here, though, that it's the framing of the choices that effectively funnel the citizens into a particular point of view? And it sounds like, right from the front, someone in the finance department at the Wellington City Council said, well, we don't have this extra revenue. We can't borrow. You can't talk about that. And go back and come up with some fresh money for us. And I wonder whether the fundamental settings in our economy and the relationship between central and local government, in which the core frames upon which you can make decisions are actually set outside the democratic process by, ratings agencies, debt strategists, and those who say, actually, our job is to reduce the size of government, and a good old debt limit will do the job. And yeah, sure, you can play around in the middle, but those are the hard limits, and you can't talk about those.
This is sort of the Bond vigilantes analysis. And I don't know. I mean, Bond vigilantes haven't stopped, all the Scandies, taxing, having high tax rates and having public sectors that, take up 50% of GDP. I think you can do all sorts of things as long as you can raise the tax revenue. Look, I mean, the Citizens Assembly wasn't maybe asked to examine sort of the absolute fundamental building blocks of anything, but actually it couldn't have, and already in a sense, I think its task was too wide, with the long term, it was very wide with the long term plan. I don't think a Citizens Assembly is, I mean, it's just banal, right? There's never a panacea. It's a useful addition. I think of it as sort of a democratic ecosystem. We're too reliant on one thing, which is parliaments and elected representatives doing things. What if we had a whole lot of other democratic forums that took on some of that decision-making work, would have a much richer, more vibrant democratic system.
No, but we need the talkback radio people to take control instead. Actually, no! Max, may I ask you a question about this? I was struck listening to you, and I'm only being slightly facetious that I remember a session in the Young Ones where the Rick with a silent P, Rick Mail character says, let's raise a people's army and take control of the state. Max, may I ask you a more general question about the election, because we've got the permission from the audience, or some of them at least, to go on a couple more minutes before they go to the TVNZ news. And what is your sense or perception now of the state of the campaign, the issues that you saw rise? When we did the start of this and we had Catherine on talking about the climate hasn't really been discussed intelligently, it seems, and very little about foreign affairs. What do you, and you are an expert, of course, on inequality, which is not the same as the cost of living. So how do you see the state of the quality of debate?
Well, some things have been quite profoundly absent from the debate, that's true, and climate change is the most glaring example of that. I mean, in a funny way, I think inequality's had a decent working over, because there's been a lot of debate about National's plan to trim the welfare budget by $2 billion and leave beneficiaries worse off than they would be under a Labour government. And we've had plenty of debate about tax as well, up to a point. I mean, and the fact there hasn't been more debate is just because Labour hasn't wanted to have it, and that's on Labour. That's how it is. Look, I mean, my general take, just sort of quickly, is, and I wrote a piece on this for the spin-off a couple of weeks ago. It's very striking. The country is very disgruntled. Almost no one thinks the country is going in the right direction, and that could have paved the way for massive, sweeping right-wing change. But actually, the two main parties are hewing very close to the centre line, and so what I think that tells you is people are very disgruntled, but they actually don't want a profound change in direction. I think they just want someone more competent running the country. It's a kind of what political science call a valence issue. It's not what's your policy, it's are you actually just going to do the things that you promised to do? And so it's just this desperate, disgruntled search for just clarity and certainty and some people who will actually deliver on their promises.
Interesting. Thanks, Matt. And because it's a bit of a thing for me that I want to know more about and understand better, how important do you think the rise of Maoridom and co-governance actually is amongst the electorate? Is it just grumpy Pākehā as I think it is, or is it part of that uncertainty and that you describe, or unhappiness that you describe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a poll done for Stuff a little while back where it said that only about a quarter of the electorate wants more co-governance than we currently have, and a lot of people think there's too much. I mean, I'm personally in favour of co-governance, but I think Labour has got a bit out ahead of where the electorate is on these issues, and hasn't wanted to front foot it either for fear of the backlash. So has tried to bring some of it in sort of undercover, and so I think there is. I mean, in the bigger picture, all the polling evidence tells you that New Zealanders of all generations are getting more comfortable with the place of the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand law. But just at the moment, there is definitely a pushback. I think it's pretty significant. It's co-governance. People are, I don't agree with it, but people are uncomfortable with the use of Māori names for government departments. I think that's real. National Party people say that comes up a lot on the campaign trail. but I think that discomfort is real,
Really
definitely.
interesting.
Unfortunately, though, when you actually look at a poll that came out in May from Core Data, 1,000 people, the question was asked, do you support co-governance or oppose it? And interestingly, those who said they completely or somewhat supported co-governance added up to 88%, and there was only 7% who said that they did not support it at all. Now, often these things can be framed or screwed in a certain way by the way the question's asked, which can change the result. But it struck me as I still think the anti-co-governance angle is quite a small proportion of New Zealand
Of
relative to the
ZB News Talk listeners.
yeah.
To push my...
500,000 people are listening to
Yeah.
News Talk ZB, but that's
Interesting.
not the full majority of the
And Max,
population.
without asking you to give you your opinion about your vote or anything at all like that, do you have a prediction about how things might end up tomorrow night?
No, no, I don't. I find it very hard to predict. I mean, I suspect Robert was right, Robert Patton, when he said it's going to be quite close. I mean, Labour, have put on a late surge, but I think the thing that's going to hold them back probably is quite low turnout, unless there's something really extraordinary tomorrow. I mean, there will be a lot of people voting tomorrow because it's not 2020 where people were worried that they wouldn't, get to the polling booth because of COVID. But I think turnout will be low, and that's always bad for the left. I mean, but it may not change the maths all that much in the end, which is that everyone's relying on Winston.
Yeah.
Which is a banal point, but may
Not at all.
just be where we're at.
And unfortunately, there is very bad weather forecast for Christchurch and Wellington tomorrow, which isn't going to be great, particularly given that the turnout before election day has been lower than in previous.
Do we what are we thinking about top and Elam, about Raf Munchie and Elam? Is that feasible? I'm not actually asking you that, Max. Something that would be unfair. I just thought you might like to stay while I asked Robert that.
The one poll that
Bernadette.
is public says that this is going to be won by National, and that both National and Labour are not stepping aside. Yesterday, Raf said he didn't think that National and Labour were campaigning properly in Ilam, and that, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, he thought that either of them would have been happy for him to win.
Oh, interesting.
But
Okay.
when they spoke to National, in particular Chris Bishop, the campaign chair, he rubbished it and said that he had rebuffed various attempts by Raf and Top to do a deal. And Sarah Pallett, the current MP, a Labour MP, said essentially to the question, do you think Raf is right when he says he thinks he can win because you're not campaigning? And she said he wishes. And both National and Labour have rejected the idea. They've done some sort of cup of tea deal.
Okay.
And I don't think at the moment it's likely he'll get up. But
Well, Max, thank you very much. And you've given everybody watching, there's 137 people who aren't switching over immediately to TVNZ. So thanks so much for that, for your very positive take on it.
Thank you very much, Max. Lovely to see you again, and thank you for coming on to the show. I'm actually looking forward to whatever you write about the democracy experiment, if only to have some hope.
Thank you, Max. It's really good. And I want to talk to you about something else at some point. I'll drop you a note. Thank you. Bernard, what's your forecast for tomorrow night?
I think,
apart from being absolutely knackered because you will have moved house during the day.
I think the winner is Winston, and the decisions that Christopher Luxon and Christopher Hipkins made much earlier in the campaign to on Hipkins' part to not deal with Winston, and B on Luxon's part to say he would deal with Winston, effectively not so much decided the election, but certainly screwed the scrum, because at that
certainly
point,
screwed AC Act, right?
Yeah.
Is that right? I mean, screwed Act relative to NZ
well,
First.
There's certainly some people who flipped back from ACT into New Zealand First, and it gave Winston relevance again, and meant he, instead of 3 or 4%, he's going to get 5 or 6%. And we are back where we've been since 1996. And for me, the most frustrating, enraging, and difficult thing is that my daughters and other people's daughters and sons are not represented in this result. Their problems are not being dealt with, and they will leave the country and say, you betrayed us, and we, as in the gerontocracy who win this election, will have nothing to come back at them with, and we'll end up watching our grandkids grow up on WhatsApp, or we join them unless we solve the problem, and we're nowhere near.
Well, it's funny you say that, because
solving
the person who accused me of talking piffle on this podcast, which I was very hurt by, is also the person who put up, I think it's an old Green slogan, which is something like "Vote Green and your grandchildren will thank you for it," or "Don't vote Green and your grandchildren won't." I mean, there is something that you can ask me about my prediction now, Bernard.
Yes. What are you expecting, Peter?
Well, I think it's not so much what I'm expecting as a prediction is that, a couple of things. Winston was apparently in all respects, a very good foreign minister. I'm not sure New Zealand can currently have a good foreign minister who doesn't deal with climate very well, as he hasn't during the campaign. And also, I was really struck, and this is absolutely not. Yes, it's New Zealand Eco Warrior. Yeah, he's the guy who invited us to stay, but then accused me of talking piffle. But this idea of a coalition of chaos that I think Luxon has been very effective on getting out there. And Ben Thomas, who I think, which side has Ben Thomas previously worked on?
He has worked for Chris Finlayson.
Yeah, so he was noting that the rise in the Greens, which we've talked about, I think, very effectively on this show for a few weeks, plus the rise of Te Pāti Māori, could create a kind of Labour Green Te Pāti Māori coalition, and that made me also think that perhaps that would actually be a more effective and transparent coalition than the last 6 years or so, because the Maori caucus has been incredibly influential, understandably and in a sense rightly, but not very transparently. And if you've got Te Pāti Māori in there, including a couple of former Labour people, of course, you might have a much more transparent approach to co-governance and to He Puapua and all of that stuff. And with the Greens, my impression is, having said previously, I think that I thought James Shaw was a bit of a wimp. He seems to have found a really strong voice during the campaign of good sense. Like, he's been the good sense broker. So I'm not sure that's a prediction, but it's a really interesting idea to actually flip the idea of a coalition of chaos onto its head, because anything where you have to negotiate with Winston is going to be rather chaotic, certainly in the negotiating. I do also think, I remember that Patrick Smelly, our old friend, is quite a big fan, or has a grudging respect, let's say, for Shane, Christ, what's his name in Northland?
Shane Jones.
Yeah, Shane Jones, who is loquacious and blasé, but he believes in what he's trying to do. So I just think it might be a slightly different coalition, and that one of them might be a coalition for chaos, a coalition of chaos, but it won't be the one that Chris Luxon has been talking about.
The only coalition of chaos we ever had was actually the first one in 96 to 99, and the others since then have been meek and mild, and at least a couple of them involved Winston. I think at the moment that the balance of probability says Winston joins National and ACT, and they have a stable coalition government in which a lot of the things Labour has brought in the last 3 years are overturned.
Yeah,
we
interesting.
had a 20% rise in house prices on Sunday.
Yes.
And
You just bought yours. You're fine. I'm fine.
200,000 young people leave the country in the next 3 to 6 years because of this. And we will have no one to blame except ourselves. And
Jesus, Bernard, this is a council of misery.
no, I think it's time to call out a bunch of people who've been deeply selfish, ignorant, and
they're boomers.
who have repeatedly voted to stop the future having a future, and
Right.
it is awful.
Is that going to stop the future having a future? Now, may I just give you a skateboarding dog? But then I also want to say something moderately serious at the end of it. So we all know that New York has an incredible problem with rats, and they've started to put their rubbish in bins rather than plastic bags. But there's a fantastic video and story of a guy driving from central New York, driving from Brooklyn to upstate New York, and having a rat crawl out of his car and sit on his bonnet, and ride with him to the wedding that he was going to.
Like one of those
Rat
sparrows on top of the rhinoceros.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Great.
Now, the thing I do also want to say, and I don't mean to be sort of pious about this, but I think it has been a hell of a week. And partly for some feedback that I got for the thing I did from Spinoff, which was from particularly from some people from a progressive synagogue in Auckland. I'd just like to say Shabbat Shalom and Juma Mubarak, which is to mark the both holy days of today. It's been a really tough week for everybody, I think, but particularly for people in those communities. And thanks. We'll talk next week about the election.
Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou i te whakapiri mai. E mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. Tēnei te mihi, mahana ki a koutou. Kia ora,
See you
people.
shortly, but ngā mihi, Bernard.
Ka pai.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you all next week.